The judiciary, the judiciary, from the nature of its functions, will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution because it will be least in a capacity to annoy or injure them. Alexander Hamilton, Federalist number 78. All right. Good morning. Welcome to another episode of the Liberty Dad Podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. I'm your host, DL, America's most objective libertarian. If you're tuning in live, thank you so much for giving me your time so early. Man, I feel like I had a little tongue twister there. Sometimes, I'm like the words, they just don't want to come out of my mouth the way they're supposed to. Um, it's kind of like worse than a Freudian slip, because it's like you're just your words are just getting to you. Anyway, today I just want to kind of quickly, yeah, we're aiming for quickly here on this show this week. So I'm going to try to narrow down from an hour to a little bit under an hour. We're trying to get this thing tightened up. I'm going to catch up with the issue of Abrego Garcia. If you remember in 481, letter of the law versus spirit of the law, I discussed the Abrego Garcia case. I criticized this idea that we're so busy throwing the book at people that we kind of forget, like, what's the spirit of the law? What is it that we're actually trying to accomplish? You might remember that Abrego Garcia is the Maryland father who was deported after being accused of being an MS-13 gang member, but not just deported, but specifically to CCOT, the El Salvador prison. So we took it a step further. And one of the points that I've been trying to make on this show so that people are very clear is that it's one thing to deport somebody. It's quite another to deport them specifically to a supermax prison in a third world country. Those are two entirely different things. And regardless of what you think about immigration, like, I know there's a lot of people out there that are like, oh, they came over illegally, just get them out. Yes, that's fine. You can have that position. However, keep in mind, what is it you are trying to accomplish? What kind of society do you want? What do you want the US to be known for? Like, it's one thing to say, like, hey, this person needs to go back home. You can make that argument and we'll have some disagreement, and that's fine. But I think you get into new territory when you don't care either the process or where they get sent. So if you're like, well, they came here illegally, and I'm like, but they were sent to a third world prison. We don't send people in this country, we don't send them to prison for violating administrative rules. It's basically paperwork. Like, imagine if you went to the DMV and you filled out your paperwork, or maybe you forgot something or whatever, right? Actually, here's a better one. Rather than you didn't go to the it's actually that you didn't go to the DMV, you didn't renew your license. Maybe you just forgot. And so you're driving around and an officer pulls you over. Says, "Hey, you were, whatever. I pulled you over for this reason." And then they look at your driver's license and they realize that it's a week expired, or maybe even a month. Imagine going to prison for that. That's the point. Like, we don't send people to prison for those kind of errors. And we can do better than that in this country. So I want to kind of catch up and say, okay, number one, what's the status of the case? And then kind of like reflect on some of my own words and say, like, well, was I accurate? Because there's a lot of people out there jockeying for your attention. And one of the issues that I brought on that on past episodes is that some of these influencers out there, they're just they're just making things up. They're not actually like reading the documents and then kind of working them out, you know, bills and court orders and stuff. They're not reading them and then saying, "All right, based on my lay understanding of the law, based on what I just read, based on my view of freedom, here's where I think this lands." Right? They're not doing that. They're just kind of regurgitating stuff. And so I think it's good to kind of look back and say, all right, is your host, me, doing the same thing? Or am I coming out, kind of on top here? So to do this, we're going to start with this video. And this is actually a press briefing from Abrego's lawyer. And we're not going to play the whole thing. The whole thing is like 20 minutes. It's linked in the show notes if you really want to check it out. I think beyond this couple of minutes that I'm going to play, unless you're really, really excited about knowing what's going on, in that case, you probably have already seen it. But unless you're really excited, I don't think you really need to watch the rest of it, but you can, like, whatever. So here we go.
Good afternoon. My name is Simon Sandoval Moschenberg with the law firm of Murray Osorio. This afternoon, we were back in front of Judge Zinnes on remand from the United States Supreme Court.
So you might, if Judge Zinnes, so this was in this conversation about, are we, do we have judges that are out there just being activists and all that? So what happened was the government, the Trump administration, they deported Abrego Garcia, and then Judge Zinnes made an order, and she said, no, he was not supposed to be, like, we've already went through this legal process. He was exempted, not from being deported, but from being deported specifically to El Salvador, because the the court determined that he made a good case that he would be harmed if he got sent specifically to that country. And then the Trump administration, kind of in their rush to get some wins and show everybody how great they're doing, they deported him anyway to El Salvador. So then Judge Zinnes came out and said, all right, look, you got to get him back. Like, that was the order. Right. And a lot of people are squealing and squawking and, very angry because they're like, oh, all these activist judges. So we're going to kind of look at this. So that's kind of the nature of what's going on if you are just coming up to speed, or maybe you didn't see some of the past episodes or what have you.
Which last night issued a unanimous 9-0 decision affirming the order of the district judge that they need to facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia to the United States and give him all of the due process that he should have had before he was illegally deported.
Okay. So I think the words he's using here, illegally deported, are true. And we really need to focus on them because two entities in the United States can do illegal things. Citizens or people, we'll say people. So people meaning citizens, anybody that's over here on a visa, and people that are here illegally. Like, people, everybody, any person in this country can do something illegal. The government also can do illegal things. If the government has already decided, if we've used the process to say, this man cannot go here, he cannot be sent here by the government, and the government does it, the government has disobeyed an order. Like, that's the same. Like, imagine if the judge told you, you've got to pay this money by such and such date, and then you didn't do it. You would be in violation, and we would expect you to have to deal with the ramifications of that violation. We should also expect the government to have to deal with ramifications when it makes a violation. And it's actually in some ways, it can be more important. So I think his words there were absolutely spot on, that it was an illegal deportation. So anybody that cares about rule of law, you cannot just say, I care about rule of law, therefore deport all these immigrants. And I don't care how you do it. Because if you care about rule of law, then you will have to care about how it's done. And so the Supreme Court had several rulings recently. Number one, they ruled that judicial review was a legitimate function of the courts, even in certain contexts, not entirely, but certain contexts of the Alien Enemy Act. They also ruled that due process was afforded to everyone before they get deported. And in the Supreme Court ruling, which I went over in the past episode, they said due process is available to everybody. They have the right to challenge the government's assertion that A, maybe they're here illegally, and then B, they need to be deported. So in this particular case, it's a very clear-cut case because the government and his own lawyers acknowledged that, yes, there was a deportation order. However, there was a limit on where he couldn't be deported to El Salvador, which happens to be his home country. He sought relief. So think about it this way. If you're like, hey, he had a deportation order, that needs to be followed. Great. That also means that the part where he wasn't supposed to be deported to El Salvador has to be followed. You see what I'm getting at, folks? Like the government has violated its own rules. And that's important. So let's continue.
And that they need to do that as quickly as possible. And that they need to share with the court information about what they're doing. After the Supreme Court issued that order, the district judge issued a further order clarifying her ruling and explaining that the government needs to take all steps reasonable to facilitate the return of Mr. Abrego Garcia to the United States.
So when he says clarified, and we'll kind of take a look at it here in a moment, that's because the ruling from the Supreme Court wasn't entirely in Judge Zinnis's order. Our favor. I mean, it actually had some disagreements, and we're going to talk about the disagreements here because I think those are important. But I just kind of want to let you know, like, there's going to be this distinction between the words facilitate and effectuate. We'll get to that.
And that in the meanwhile, it needs to provide the court with information, specifically 3 pieces of information. 1, where is Mr. Abrego Garcia right now? What is his custodial status? 2, what has the government done so far to try to bring him back? There were several days when the court's order was in effect prior to the Supreme Court entering a stay. And now it's been more than 12 hours since the Supreme Court lifted the stay. What has the government done during that time to bring him back? And then 3, what is the government planning to do to carry out the court's order, which is, again, to take all reasonable steps to facilitate the return of Mr. Abrego Garcia to the United States as quickly as possible.
Okay, let's pause this for a second. So just ask yourself, we're not lawyers here, okay? So there's an argument to be had among lawyers, to what degree, what do these words mean? All these things related to the legal process that we don't necessarily get into. What does this mean in the grand scheme of things? I was listening to, I think it was Bloomberg Law over the weekend, and there was a lawyer, I think it was a law professor on, and they were making some interesting points about when you read the Supreme Court rulings, that based on what they say, and in some cases what they don't say, what the implications of that are, mean. And then they were putting it in the context of like, okay, who are these justices? Are these justices, tend to be more favorable to immigrants or immigration cases, or do they tend to be less favorable? And since they agreed with this particular ruling, what does that ultimately mean? What we might be able to speculate on the future. Legal people will do all of that. What I want you to do as just a regular listener, because the point of the show is to say, like, look, with just a little bit of reading, we can learn a lot. And then we can really think about this and say, like, what kind of country do we want? So ask yourself, were those three things reasonable that Judge Zinnis said, okay, she basically amended her previous order, or you could say clarified, if you will. But she clarified her order and she brought it down from facilitate and effectuate down to just facilitate. Again, we'll get into that in just a moment. So she kind of amended it a little bit. And then she went on and said, look, you need to tell us, you need to give us updates where Abrego Garcia is, what you're doing right now, what you have done to try to facilitate his return, and what you plan on doing since he's not here yet. So ask yourself, is that reasonable in light of all of this? Is it reasonable? Is it a reasonable demand upon the government after it's been said that, yep, you need to help facilitate his return? Is it reasonable for a judge to say, you got to tell us where he is? You got to tell us what you've done? You got to tell us what you plan on doing since he's not here yet. Does that sound unreasonable to you? And the reason I'm asking that is because my next question is, if it doesn't sound unreasonable, then are we really dealing with activist judges? Right? Because that's been part of the conversation lately. He's like, oh, these activist judges, they're ruining the Constitution. Are they? I mean, you could make some arguments that certain rulings have not been good rulings and have maybe diminished the Constitution as you understand it. But does it rise to the level of saying we have activist judges out there? And I'm going to say no, because I think this is a very reasonable demand. Tell us where he is. What have you done? What are you doing? We want to know. This man was illegally deported. You, government, violated the law. It is on you to, in some way, rectify this situation. Let's continue listening. We're almost done.
The government refused to provide any of those pieces of information that the judge ordered them to provide. Not only the information about what future steps they're planning to take, they even refused to answer the question about what they've done so far. And they even refused to answer the question about where Kilmer Abrego Garcia is today.
Now, if we've established that those were reasonable questions, shouldn't we be kind of angry with the government for not following what it was ordered to do? I mean, we want people to follow the law here in this country. We've got a large number of people who insist and say, hey, we're going to deport you if you come over here and you don't, fill out paperwork. You don't go through a port of entry and get yourself documented. We're deporting you. The law is the law. That's kind of how they're saying it. Fine. The law is the law when it comes to the government, right? Or is it acceptable that just because you don't want somebody here, because they're not a high priority to you, therefore the government doesn't have to follow the law all of a sudden? And I keep hammering on this because I want a consistent country. And I think we can actually get to a better place if we start acknowledging that we're not necessarily being consistent and we're not necessarily adhering to the rule of law. Not the government isn't, and a lot of people are basically they're assisting in a sense, right? You've become a bit of a participant by permitting them to do so. You're an enabler, put it that way. Let's listen to the last few seconds here.
For the second time in this case, they sent a lawyer into court who had no answers.
So let me remember when I walked through the scenario of the roughly 300 Venezuelans that got deported, and I said the State Department had sent a lawyer in, and then that was with Judge Boasberg, and Judge Boasberg was like, "Yo," I mean, he didn't say "yo" because, that's not how they speak in the courtroom, but he was like, "Yo, what's going on? Where are these detainees?" And the lawyer was like, "Man, I don't know." And then they literally had to pause and they had to have a recess so the lawyer could go get some answers. He literally showed up unprepared to answer some basic questions. If the government is removing people and it's being challenged in court, and then people are like, "Yo, where are they? Give us some basic details about this particular case." The lawyer for the government. We're not talking about just some like random guy, and they can't answer that. And then we delay our process. Then is it really a problem that we have activist judges? No, it sounds like we have an activist executive branch. That's the branch that seems to be playing activist right now because they're doing all like I demonstrated through the timeline, and it was kind of affirmed, sort of, in the Supreme Court ruling in the dissent. So, not really affirmed, but others noticed it. It was noticed that the government appeared to be operating in a way to get around judicial review. Like they knew, hey, as soon as the judicial branch finds out about this, we're gonna have to be, they're gonna call us out, and we're gonna have to, they're gonna probably rule against us. So in order to prevent that from happening, they skirt the system so that they can get what they want. And then now we're here. And then in this particular case, this lawyer is like, look, this is the second time that lawyers have shown up, and he's talking about his particular case. The second time the lawyers have shown up and they didn't have basic answers. So we had the case. We have the case of Abrego Garcia, with twice now lawyers for the government have showed up unable to answer basic questions and had to go back and get them. And then in another case, a similar case, the Justice Department lawyers, they showed up and they didn't have basic answers. So ask yourself, from a very lay perspective, is that acceptable to you that the government can do things and then basically play games so they don't have to be held accountable, or drag it out so that whatever accountability that they know is coming will be delayed longer? Imagine if that was you in your case, for whatever reason. Imagine if the government was playing games. You're trying to fight back, and you've got a lawyer, and your lawyer's trying to fight on your behalf and say, hey, the government has violated your rights or what it's supposed to do. And now they're playing games, not being prepared, simply not responding, just kind of ignoring it and saying, yeah, we heard you, but whatever. Is that acceptable? So if we want, like, I hear a lot of people talking about activist judges, but nobody's saying, hey, we've got an activist executive branch. Right? We're so gung ho about getting about deporting people that aren't, legally here, that we seem to be giving a pass to our own government on how they do that. Well, guess what? When the government realizes how lazy you are about fighting for, due process and the rule of law, who do you think is next? Could be you.
He explained that his clients, the government, have chosen not to give him any information, not to give him any evidence. And the district judge, appropriately, was not willing to accept their vague and unsubstantiated assertions that, don't worry, Judge, we'll take care of this all in due course.
I think this is a big problem. I do not like the idea. And now, when I say big problem, I'm not going to call it a constitutional crisis. I'm just going to say I think they're wrong. And I think the American people should be relatively irritated over this. Just because the American people should expect that if there's anybody that's following the rule of law to a T, it's supposed to be the government. Like, we would like it if all the people were, but the government especially. Why? Because the government has the power to put you in jail. They have the power to deport you. So imagine if you were wrongfully deported, you're a citizen, and then the government's dragging their feet on court orders to get you back. Would you be so excited then? No. And this is what we want to prevent. So let's recap some of these. We're just going to kind of look briefly at some of these court orders. I'm not going to read them all in full. So let me put this first one up on the screen here. So this is literally, I'm just going to be very brief about this. So this is initially when you read Judge Zinnis's order, the full ruling, it ends up here. She says, defendants are hereby ordered to facilitate and effectuate the return of plaintiff Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia to the United States by no later than 11:59 p.m. on Monday, April 7th, 2025. So it's April 14th, and Abrego Garcia is still not here. So that didn't happen. And then it got to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court came out, and this is what they said. They said the application is granted in part and denied in part, subject to the direction of this order. So they're talking about the ruling from the district court that I just read, which was just like a little quick summary of it. Due to the administrative stay issued by the Chief Justice, the deadline imposed by the district court has now passed. So that April 7th deadline was passed even by the time that the Supreme Court had their ruling. To that extent, the government's emergency application is effectively granted in part, and the deadline in the challenged order is no longer effective. Okay, so like that makes sense. Like, okay, we're past that due date. So now what? The rest of the district court's order remains in effect, but requires clarification on remand. The order properly requires the government to facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador and to ensure that his case is handled as it would have been had he not been improperly sent to El Salvador. The intended scope of the term effectuate in the district court's order is, however, unclear and may exceed the district court's authority. The district court should clarify its directive with due regard for the deference owed to the executive branch in the conduct of foreign affairs. So I thought that was kind of interesting. What are they saying? They're basically saying, like, look, the deadline's passed. Fine. Can't do much about that. And we're generally going to agree, and this is a 9-0 ruling. We generally agree that the district court was correct when they said you have to facilitate the Abrego Garcia's return to the United States. And they said you have to give him the proper due process. And we can look back at the previous Supreme Court ruling where they said due process is afforded to everyone in this country. Everyone, if you accuse somebody of being an illegal immigrant and you say we can deport them, they have the right, the due process to challenge that. So when people say, "Oh, they don't have due process," let them, and and a lot of people, the same people that are saying there's no due process for people, it's only for citizens. Those same people will also demand that people get deported because they didn't follow the rule of law. Well, the Supreme Court says and has repeatedly said over the years, this isn't even the Supreme Court necessarily being an activist. They're saying, no, it's a well-established principle that everybody has due process. And so if people don't let people talk out of both sides of their mouth. Either they mean it when they say the rule of law or they don't. And again, 9-0 saying you have to facilitate this. But then it was interesting because then they go, and I'm going to bring that back up here real quick. But then they go, and it's that very last couple of lines there. They said, the intended scope of the term effectuate in the district court's order is, however, unclear and may exceed the district court's authority. So the Supreme Court is like, look, we kind of agree with you, but you might be overstepping your boundaries. So what does that mean? Is there a constitutional crisis? Doesn't seem like it. Doesn't seem like it at all from either way, right? The government did something they weren't supposed to do. The district court said, no, you've got to resolve this. The Supreme Court said, yeah, we agree, you got to resolve this. However, we think that you might be stepping in a little bit beyond the scope of your authority. So you need to correct that, right? And they said the district court should clarify its directive with due regard for the deference owed to the executive branch. So like, look, remember, it's the executive branch. They have their rights, or I don't want to say rights, they have their responsibilities laid out. You have your responsibilities laid out. They have their limitations. You have your limitations. You need to respect that. It's basically what it's saying, right? Like, we don't need to be lawyers to figure this out. So when people are complaining on on any side, you can point to them and say, no, look at how this process is playing out. The process is playing out that, the government does something. People go to the judicial branch. The judicial branch makes a ruling. People contest that. A higher court looks at it and agrees on some parts and disagrees on others. Is that, again, what we want out of our country? Is that the kind of country that you want? You see, here's the thing, people. You don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be a judge. You don't have to have any training. You just need to be able to read and understand your rights at a basic, at the core. Let me tell you a little story. So when I was 15, I was taking martial arts. I was taking Taekwondo, and my Taekwondo instructor, he was telling us, like at that time, Bruce Lee movies and Jean-Claude Van Damme movies and, all those movies, American Ninja, all that, they were super, super popular. Like, that was like the age of martial art movies. And so there, you saw a lot of fancy stuff in there, right? And so he was saying, he was like, look, all these fancy moves, those are fine, those are cool looking. But the reality is, if you understand the basics and you understand them well, you can beat an opponent who does all these fancy flips and judo kicks and whatever, like you just need to know the basics. Well, I think that applies here. If you understand the basics of freedom and you understand the basics of our law, you can make educated opinions by simply reading these things and saying, no, I think this is wrong. Will we always be correct? No, because the courts are going to be, filled with judges who are more familiar with the law. There'll be lawyers that'll point out what this case over here said, stuff that we're not necessarily going to know, right? So there's going to be a certain limitation we have, but we can reasonably understand things and we can reasonably come to conclusions just by reading, right? Like we've already looked at basically 3 different rulings. Actually, I think there's a third one to look at here. So let's pull that up real quick. And so then here's the amended or the clarified order, a snippet of it. Judge Zinna says the Supreme Court's April 10th, 2025 decision affirmed this court's order and directed that on remand, this court clarify its use of the term effectuate, according proper deference to the executive branch in its conduct of foreign affairs. To this end, the court hereby amends the order to direct that defendants take all available steps to facilitate the return of Abrego Garcia to the United States as soon as possible. That's basically fundamentally this new clarification. So she removes effectuate, because effectuate was initially in there, right? And the Supreme Court said, hey, we see that as a problem. So why? What is the big deal? What is the difference between, facilitate and effectuate? So if you look them up, just at a simple definition, facilitate means to make an action or process easier or assist in its occurrence without necessarily ensuring its completion. Whereas effectuate says to actively cause something to happen or bring it about. It implies a more direct role in ensuring the outcome is achieved. So when the judge said, hey, you need to facilitate and effectuate, she basically said, you need to take action to make this process occur, but then you need to also ensure that it happens. And the Supreme Court's like, I don't know that you can say ensure that it happens, because you're dealing with international and foreign issues. So there's a certain limitation. You can say, hey, look, you need to go do things to facilitate his return because you sent him there illegally. But we can't order you to ensure that he gets back. So it's kind of weird in a sense. But the difference is basically between using a process to make sure something happens or a process intended to make sure that something happens and ensuring the actual outcome. The U.S. government cannot ensure the outcome, obviously, because they don't have authority over El Salvador. But that doesn't mean that they don't have some level of influence. And it's funny because there was a news I don't have it, but there was a news article I was reading, and somebody pointed back to I think it was a 2019 post. I think it was a 2019 post by Donald Trump where he's bragging about his hostage negotiation skills. Well, okay, great. Abrego's a hostage now in El Salvador. So, since you boasted about your skills, how about you use them right about now to fulfill the order by the district court that the Supreme Court has said, yes, that is a legitimate order. You need to do that. So, ultimately, at the end of the day, I was right. I was right that there was no constitutional crisis. In episode 472, Trump versus due process, I criticized both Chris Mowry and the redheaded libertarian. They're both influencers on social media. I criticized both of them. I said, look, I think you both have gotten this wrong, and it could have been resolved simply by reading. Reading will take you a long way, but instead, I felt like they were regurgitating what they maybe saw in the news as opposed to sat down, read the documents, and then deciphered the documents in their understanding based on their understanding of, okay, what does it mean to have civil liberties here? What does it mean to have rights? What do we believe those rights are? Right? And I feel like if you had a good understanding of all of that, you could have come easily to the right conclusion. I was also right that Abrego was wrongfully sent to CCOT. This was determined by a district court. The administration even acknowledged it. So the Trump administration has acknowledged this. And then SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, they ruled 9-0. Yes, he was never supposed to be sent there. And yes, you do need to facilitate his return. So as we can see, federal judge made a ruling. It was contested by the administration. Supreme Court reviewed it. They agreed with part of Judge Zinnis's ruling. They disagreed with others. And they basically told the judge to mind the limits of her authority. And then Zinnis amended her ruling to limit it only to facilitate. And now we see that the government is kind of dragging its feet. So let me read this from NPR. We're going to wind it down here in just a few minutes. So, here's from NPR. Let me read it. It says, Judge. So this was April 12th. So this is Saturday. Trump admin tells judge man wrongfully deported to El Salvador is alive, still detained. Okay, so after all of that, because everything that I read you and showed you was a little bit on the older side, older meaning like literally a week ago, as opposed to a couple of days ago. So here's what it says. A Maryland man who was wrongfully deported to El Salvador is alive and still detained in the country, the Trump administration said in a filing to a federal judge on Saturday. So the Trump administration has finally complied and said, here's some information about Abrego Garcia. Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia is being held at El Salvador's Terrorism Confinement Center, according to Michael Kozak, a senior official in State Department's Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs, citing the United States Embassy in San Salvador in the filing. And it's quoting him. He's alive and secure in that facility. He is detained pursuant to the sovereign domestic authority of El Salvador. The filing follows federal judge Paula Zena's order on Friday that Trump administration provide daily updates on their efforts to return Abrego Garcia to the United States. In her new order, which was issued after the Supreme Court upheld her original order to bring Abrego Garcia back, Zenas directed the federal government to, quote, take all available steps to facilitate the return of Abrego, end quote, of Abrego Garcia to the United States as soon as possible. She also ordered the Justice Department to provide an immediate update on his location and status, the steps the government has taken so far to bring Abrego Garcia back, and what additional actions it is considering. Here's a nice little highlight. The Trump administration on Friday asked for more time to answer Zinnis's questions, arguing that the government needs, quote, a meaningful opportunity to review the Supreme Court's decision before it is ordered to report what steps it will take in response to that decision. Now, isn't that interesting, right? You've got all these orders, and you've got the Supreme Court saying, all right, here's where we land on this. And then the Trump administration is like, yeah, we really can't answer your questions because we need more time to really understand the Supreme Court's decision. In other words, let's just cut the BS. What they're doing is they're saying, all right, let's figure out how we can get around this to our advantage. That's what they're doing. They're reading it and they're researching so that their next move, which people are probably not going to like, they can defend that. That's what they're doing. So ask yourself, like, is that something you're comfortable with? You cool with the government doing that? They've been ordered to work on bringing this man back. They've been ordered to tell where is he? What have you been doing? What will you be doing? They've been ordered. At some point, you have to hold the people that you've elected accountable. And if you're not willing to do that, then you get what you get. And it could be bad for you because if you don't hold the government accountable when it's your guy, then what happens is when it's not your guy, then you're going to want to hold them accountable, but they'll have precedent. They'll know what they can at least get away with or what they can at least drag out. That's going to be bad for you when the shoe is on the other foot. Abrego Garcia is a Salvadoran resident or citizen who has lived in Maryland for almost 15 years. While he initially entered the U.S. without being granted legal status, a federal judge in 2019 granted him protection from being deported due to concerns for his safety if he were returned to return to El Salvador. He also has had no criminal record. Okay, so again, either you care about the rule of law or you don't. And if you care and you say, well, he came here illegally, he's got to go. Okay, you're looking at the law. We just read that the court granted him that protection from being deported to El Salvador, specifically that one. Okay, that is the rule of law, right? That's how our government works. It's how our society works. So either you mean it or you don't. Abrego Garcia was arrested in March and a few days later placed on a flight with other men the Trump administration alleged were members of the Venezuelan gang Tren de Aragua. A Justice Department lawyer conceded in court that Abrego Garcia's deportation was a mistake, or as he put it, an administrative error. When you think about a loved one, I want you to think, would you be okay if they got deported due to an administrative error? Would you be okay with that? The answer is no. We already know what the answer is. Like, we can answer this. I can answer that question for you. You would not be okay with it. And you would not be okay if you found out later that the administration was dragging their feet despite court orders that had been reviewed by higher courts and affirmed in part. Abrego Garcia's attorney, Simon Sandoval Moschenberg, said in a statement to NPR, "We are incredulous. 24 more hours and still no answers as to what they've done so far and what they're planning to do forward to carry out the Supreme Court's ruling." Murray Osorio PLLC, an immigration law firm Sandoval Moschenberg is with, that is also representing Abrego Garcia, said in an additional statement that while the acknowledgement of his location is a, quote, overdue first step, it does nothing to address the government's obligation to return him safely and immediately to the United States, end quote. And then they go on and they say, the continued delay in executing a Supreme Court mandate is not only unacceptable, it is a direct affront to the rule of law. The Department of Homeland Security and the Department of State must act without further delay and provide full transparency about the steps being taken to ensure Mr. Abrego Garcia's safe return. Okay? So think about that for a second. Without further delay. Think about all the people that have been like, hey, you're illegal, you need to go. When do the same people say they need to go? They say they need to go right now. Okay, great. It was illegal that he was deported to El Salvador. The courts have ruled that the Trump administration has to facilitate his return. They are dragging their feet. They are not doing this immediately. So ask yourself if you're being consistent. Are you being consistent and saying, hey, this guy got to go immediately? Oh, wait a minute. You got to bring him back. Bring him. You got to divulge what you've been doing. Do that immediately. Hold them accountable. Like, even if you want people deported, you can still get that through all of this. The courts are just saying you have to be mindful of the proper process to make this happen. And as I've said before, why do we care about that process? Because it protects Americans at a bare minimum. Like, maybe you don't care about other people, right? Maybe you're like, hey, citizenship, that's what matters. Nothing else matters to anybody else. Even if you're at that, which I think is a very wrong-headed and foolish position, but even if that's where you are, you have to acknowledge that you want the government to do the right thing because it could be you. And if the government was dragging their feet with you, you are all of a sudden going to be mad and like, whoa, you need to follow the rules. You need to follow the rule of law. So I was right about this case, right? Abrego was wrongfully sent to CCOT. Again, determined by a district court. The administration acknowledged. Supreme Court ruled, right? I was right that there's not a constitutional crisis. We do see this playing out where we're identifying and talking about, hey, the limits of judicial power versus the limits of executive power. And so, like, I think this is to my credit, and I'm pretty proud of myself for having read. That's all I did. I read and I understood the basics. And if you do that, it'll take you a long way. Now, am I always right? Not really. Try to downplay a little bit. Like, I don't want to say no exactly. It's just like, not really exactly. Um, but it's important that we read. And why do I care about all this? Because I actually do care about the rule of law. I care about how it applies to people, and more importantly, how it applies to government. Because here's how this works. People have rights. The government can take them away or deny them, right? Like, they can lock you up, which is taking away your right to, freedom of movement and, so on and so forth. So the government can deny you your rights. You cannot deny the government rights. There's no such thing because the government doesn't have rights, right? So you see how there's an imbalance of power. This is why the rule of law is so important. Because if I break the law, the government says, okay, you broke the law. Who did you harm? Who do you owe restitution to, etc. But if the government breaks the law, then my rights might be violated. And that's a problem because the government should be held to more account because of that. It has more power to violate the rights of people and get away with it, as we're seeing happen, as I've been complaining about and saying, you have to be mindful of due process. You have to be mindful of judicial review. You have to make sure that if you are sending somebody, if you're deporting somebody, just regular, plain old, boring deportation, if you're deporting somebody, then that person should at least be somebody that falls within the scope of being deported by the rules that we have at a minimum. We can disagree whether or not we should deport people, but we have it on the books. We have the law. The government should be following the law. Is this person here illegally? Okay, they are. All right, let's send them back. Okay, fine. That's the rule of law that we have. But we have to make sure that this person is the right person, that they actually are here illegally, right? You have to make sure those two things. It's the right person and they did it. You have to know those things. The government needs to know those things. And they need to be able to demonstrate it to the American people. But then it gets stepped up even more when we're talking about sending people to prison. Deportation under normal circumstances is not a prison sentence. It is simply saying, you're not allowed to be here. Get out by, come back the right way. That's all that is. So when you step it up and you send somebody to a to a third world prison, well, now if America is going to be great, we need to be mindful that, yes, you are a criminal that deserves to be in this prison. You know, it's interesting that so many people will get fired up over an immigrant coming here illegally, where their only violation is not getting permission. But otherwise, they're contributing to society, right? And we know this. I don't think anybody's arguing against the idea that there are people here illegally and their only crime, the only thing that they've done wrong is that they didn't get permission to come here. But they're otherwise going to work, doing a job, raising a family, paying whatever bills that they're supposed to be paying, right? Maybe they're renting from somebody and they're paying somebody rent. They're basically otherwise doing exactly what we want them to do. They're contributing to society. It's interesting that so many people will get fired up over the mere fact that they did that by not getting permission to come here, but then they're rather quiet when the government disregards rulings and deports people to third world supermax prisons, people that potentially don't belong there. So where are those people making noise? And this is the accountability that we have to hold each other to. We hold our government accountable and we hold each other and we say, hey, you want America to be great? MAGA, make America great again, make America stay great, whatever. Like, then fine. Hold your own government accountable when they're not doing things that otherwise are part of a great country. A great country is one that respects the rights of people. That's one of the things that makes America great is that we have rights, they've been established, and they're respected. And when somebody violates them, then we punish them. If you want somebody punished for stealing your car, for illegally coming here, you should equally want your government punished when they do things illegally. And that is what happened. So that's my show. Let's take a look at some comments. I guess I thought I could get this done in a little bit shorter amount of time, but it looks like I kept close to my 1 hour time frame anyway. But let's get to some comments here. Let's check that out. All right, so let's see here. Where is that? Do that there. Okay, so let's see. Looks like there's only comments here in the Rumble chat, so that's cool. Keith points out, says, I still say the presidency has too much power. The whole federal government does too, in my opinion. I agree. They have entirely too much power. And when I come out and I say, like, I don't think there's a constitutional crisis, I don't think that there are activist judges. I mean, not in the sense that people are presenting it. I think there is activism everywhere, but not to the level that people are presenting it. But when I push back, I'm pushing back because I believe that the federal government has too much power, whether that power is actually granted or they're just kind of taking it. I think that's a problem, and I want to rein it in. I want the government to do things the right way and to remember that they have limitations. The Constitution is one big document of limitations on the rights that, what you can and cannot do and under what circumstances you can do, limiting the rights of the people. Those are limits. And I want those limits enforced because our rights are that important. Let's see what else. What do we got here? Abolish the IRS. Not sure what that has to do necessarily with today's cases, but it's always a good mention, right? Abolish the IRS. There's a few other agencies that I would abolish as well. Let's see. What else we got? Looks like some conversations going on in the chat. Keith points out, I have a Filipina friend who can't go home for a visit because she would not be allowed to come back. She is legal. Yeah, I think there's a lot of uncertainty, and that's a problem. I've got some friends too, some friends from Venezuela, actually, who are here going through the asylum process. And it's been like years. And, I have concerns. Like, what if they get sent back? Now they're here legally, right? But we've seen that the government has revoked even legal statuses. That's not acceptable to me. And Joe, a good way to end this. Joe says there's no such thing as illegal immigrants. I agree. I For me, I'm not an open borders. I'm not a closed borders guy. I will just repeat it. I am more of an Ellis Island style guy. And I say, like, look, as long as you don't have a serious communicable disease, and then as long as you are not a violent criminal, then you should be allowed to come over to this country. That's simple. And when you get here, we're not obligated to help you. We're not obligated to put anything in Spanish or any other language. We're not obligated to give you any welfare. You could be in poverty. We let you come here and you're on your own. And your job when you get here is to make yourself a productive member of society. That's your role. But it's so long as you are not stealing, committing violent crimes, you know what? Give it a shot. That's where I am with that. So yeah, I would agree in the current context that we have, no such thing as an illegal immigrant. And just to reiterate, if the government wants to deport, say, violent gang members to a third world prison, I'm actually okay with that, so long as they get due process. So long as the government can demonstrate that, yes, we made sure this is the person that we said they were. This is the act. We have, here's the evidence of the violence that they, the violent acts that they've done. This is why they deserve to go to prison. Same as we would do in our country. We cannot lock up people. The government doesn't get to just lock people up in prison because they said so. The government has to prove, yes, you did this, prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. And I want the same thing before we send anybody to any prison anywhere. I want to make sure you are guilty specifically of violence. I'm not into sending people to third world prisons because you showed up and you just didn't get permission. That's not a great America. And I will die on that hill. I've said it before. I will die on the hill of due process. All right. Well, that's my show for today. I will see you guys tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this episode informative and inspiring. Be sure to catch me Monday through Friday, 7:30 a.m. for an informed discussion on politics and culture. Make sure that you're subscribed to my YouTube channel, or if you prefer my Rumble channel, you can go to youtube.libertydad.com, or you can go to rumble.libertydad.com. While you are there, let me know how I'm doing by leaving me a comment. You can also become part of the community by heading over to locals.com. Remember, if you're a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. Catch you next time. But for now, I'm out.